I like it. Nice response. So, my name is Jeff Kaplan. I'm a professor here in Management and International Business. And for this academic year, I'm the interim director of the Principal Center for Global Citizenship. For the last few years, at least in recent memory, we've had the pleasure each year of organizing at least one event, bringing together the expertise of our community partners at Principal with the expertise here at the Drake community, and this year is no exception. This evening, the theme for our spring talk is the future of trade in an era of anti-globalism. If you've watched the news at all, it's clear that trade is on people's minds. If you were following the Business Record today, the position on trade changed with every single news release that the Business Record did. First, China was being nice to us, then they slapped us with a 179% tariff on certain grains, and then Japan said they don't want to renegotiate. So there's a lot going on in the world of trade today, for sure. So welcome. What I'm going to do, I'll introduce briefly the folks at the table, and then we'll get started right away. We will go through some questions that we've prepared, and then we will pass around. There's some cards that will circulate if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the panel as we get to the second half of the event this evening. So I will start at the end of the table. It's my pleasure to introduce, and let's give a warm bulldog welcome to each of them in turn. First, Mr. Bob Baur, Executive Director and Principal Chief Global Economist for Principal Global Investors. Next, coming down the line, Professor Rachel Paine Caufield, who I heard is going to explain the Trump voter to us this evening, and we're all very excited to welcome her from Drake's Political Science Department. Next, Jim McCaughan, President of Global Asset Management and CEO of Principal Global Investors. And finally, our moderator for the evening, my friend and colleague, Professor Matthew Mitchell, who I coaxed out of sabbatical just for this event. So, thank you, Matthew.
Absolutely. Good evening. Thank you for being here. We were, as panelists, I think, warmly received and definitely excited to see. Maybe, I don't know that this is the first event, but you had to bring in 2 rounds of extra chairs. So bravo to you for coming out this evening on a lovely spring evening to come talk with the panel. I couldn't be more excited about this conversation, and I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as I possibly can for one reason and one reason only. When Jeff and I were thinking about this panel and kind of talking about it, the folks you see represented before you are absolutely, without a doubt, the most world-class people that we have in our community. They're the best that Drake and Principal has to offer. And not only that, but they tend to throw in red meat statements and questions out into the conversation. So we're just going to watch us all kind of rip apart this red meat in a feeding frenzy and really get down to it, because this is an important conversation.
Just setting a big target.
I am. Regardless, we're going to have a lot of fun. Nobody's going to get torn to shreds at all. I promise. So the theme of the evening is the future of trade in an era of anti-globalism. The order and agenda of our conversation this evening is going to be first and foremost facts. We're going to try to explain what we think anti-globalism is, what globalism is, why you should care as college students, why you should care as residents of Des Moines, as residents of Iowa. We'll start with facts, then we'll move into opinion, and so we may then finish up with kind of prognostications and looking into our crystal ball and saying, this is what we think could potentially happen. So we've chatted as a panel. We've got some questions teed up in terms of how we think we will best explain this, and then we'll turn it over to you. We're very, very interested in your thoughts. What do you think about? What do you think about anti-globalism, globalization, the future of trade, the future for Iowa, the future for the world? So with that, I'll probably turn it over, and we'll start at the end with a very generic question. Bob, Rachel, Jim, what is globalism? What is globalization? And why should we care?
Well, globalization in some sense is really about income convergence. It's about lowering trade barriers as we did in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. There was a lot of negotiations going on. It was the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the late 80s and 90s, and that culminated with the creation of the World Trade Organization in January of 1995. China joined that organization in 2001. Now, when you take down trade barriers, what you do is you bring into the market, really, at that time, hundreds of millions of very low-wage, underemployed workers into the global economy. And then when trade barriers come down, then world trade expands. So in the United States, we import cheaper goods. Global companies want to move in and hire these workers that are being paid a lower wage. They make their products more cheaper, then they can export cheaper products to the United States. It saves people money. And in some sense, globalization was an enormous positive because it made cheaper goods for developed countries. It created jobs for people that didn't have jobs or had very low-wage jobs at that time in places like China and India, South America, Eastern Europe. And it was a very positive thing. There were some problems, though, and there were some people kind of left out of that process that I think we'll get into a little bit later.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Rachel is our resident guru of political science. What is globalization and what's its implications for the U.S.?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, nor am I a trade specialist. So my role here, I think, as much as anything, is to kind of translate this into the American political environment. What is globalization and globalism in our current political rhetoric? And I would agree completely from the perspective of economic forces with the description of globalization. Globalism, I think, is a bit different in terms of how we talk about our role in the world. And so I would kind of focus on the idea of globalism as this notion that there is a convergence around the world around a set of fundamental norms and expectations within the economic sphere, but that translates into other spheres as well, our social spheres, our political spheres. And as that happens, there has been, not just in the United States, but elsewhere around the world, there has been, I think, a pretty strong backlash at this notion that the economic forces that have benefited from globalization are disproportionately distributed among a few people in the world. And so globalization, when viewed with distrust in our political rhetoric in particular, it's referring to a notion that our inequalities are growing and the have-nots are being systematically disadvantaged in an economically globalizing world.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Bob and Rachel. I suggest there is a really important dichotomy here between the facts, as the economic theory would suggest, and the facts as they come out in terms of political opinion. What I mean by that is, I would argue that the main engine of prosperity for the West and for the emerging countries of the East, the main engine of prosperity has been two things. It's been trade and it's been competition. Competition goes back, right back to Adam Smith, the guiding hand. Competition leads to better allocation of resources, more productive allocation of resources. Trade through comparative advantage is not a zero-sum game. The theory is one thing, but the facts actually support the theory in this case. They don't always in economics, but in this case they do. And the facts are that countries that trade get rapidly richer because competition keeps businesses honest and keeps innovation moving, and because whenever someone sells someone something, both parties are basically better off. It is not the zero-sum game that some politicians would have you believe. So there's the facts, the positive side for trade. The negative side is what Rachel said. It's the perceptions by many people that they've been disadvantaged by trade. The foreigners have stolen their jobs. The jobs have gone to Mexico or China, in the case of the US. But you know, you get the same story in Europe. You get the same story in Japan. You know, Prime Minister Abe, who is with President Trump right now, is a Japan first guy, just as President Trump is America first. And in both cases, their interpretation is the narrow self-interest. They're both able to, you know, to basically prey on, I believe, people who perceive themselves as having jobs stolen by the foreigner. And I would argue that's not really what's happened. I think it's more about technology. I think 80 or 90% of the job losses that have happened, particularly with the white working class, the non-college educated in the US, who have seen their living standards stagnate for 20 years, the reason for that is more technology than it is trade. But I think it's often seen as an unintended consequence of trade and as something that has hurt them. And that's why you get this rebellion against the global system. Not just here. You have AfD in Germany, who are getting pretty close to power. They're actually ahead of the Social Democrats in German polling. You had the National Front in France. You had the Brexit vote, for goodness sake. And unlike a presidential election, that may prove irreversible. And Italy, of course, which is divided north-south between Five Star, which is a left-wing populist movement, and Forza Italia, which is a right-wing populist movement. So the politics are really driving perceptions of economic reality, and politicians are creating that division and that dissent by, I believe, misrepresenting trade. So I think that's the scene you're looking at. There is a big risk in this, which is if politics impair free trade, they put at risk the prosperity of the developed world. And I take that very seriously.
If politics are driving the perception, they put at risk the prosperity of the free world. It's kind of important, and I'm glad we're here to kind of solve those problems tonight.
Those problems tonight, we're over our head.
We're solving those problems, we're in over our head. So, to Bob's point, in some sense, globalization was a benefit. To Rachel's point, some were more equal than others. There's a driving inequality, and Jim kind of mentioned there's winners and losers, and I think perpetual inequality. I guess let's take this back to the American voter. What would you say is the dominant perspective of the American voter when they think about globalism and trade at the moment?
So one of the difficulties here, and I would agree completely, I think there's a misunderstanding about what the fundamental underlying dynamics are within the new globalized world, or the new globalist world, depending on who you're talking to. But I think overall, the way that political arguments are constructed and the way that this is presented to the American voter, as well as voters around the world, right? This becomes a question of us versus them very easily. And if you go back, I spent some time going back into some of the public opinion polling, and one of the interesting things that has happened over time is that we saw, on the whole, a general consensus that emerged that free trade was generally good for the United States, but also good for the world. And so there was a widely held view that this was not a zero-sum game, that ultimately it would be good for American workers as well as American consumers to open up trade and to expand markets around the world. That seems to be very, very, very consistent. There seems to be a little blip, for lack of a better word, a little blip in the early 90s, and I assume, I think that corresponds with discussions about NAFTA. And then you hit the 2016 election. And in 2016, a lot of the opinion polls all of a sudden nearly reversed themselves regarding perceptions of whether or not globalism or trade or free trade agreements, however you kind of look at the question, there seems to be an absolute complete 180, where you have majorities opposing free trade. And I think there are a lot of potential reasons that we may have seen that, but overwhelmingly, remember that we saw very strong anti-free trade arguments coming from Donald Trump on the campaign trail. But what we forget, and we're only 2 years out here, but what we forget is that we also saw incredibly strong anti-free trade agreements coming from Bernie Sanders. So in both parties, you had this divide between this mainstream view that accepted and embraced globalism, free trade agendas, and then you also, within both parties, had a faction that was very firmly committed to this new notion of populism that is emerging in countries around the world, i.e. the idea of protecting the interests of a sovereign state, which presumably implies shutting down some of those mechanisms of free trade, erecting more barriers in the global trading system.
So we saw a reversal, a 180-degree switch in public opinion polling. Bob, are we in an era of anti-globalism?
I guess I wouldn't call it so much anti-globalism as I would call it recognizing the limits, perhaps, of free trade. And there really are limits. I'd make a couple of points. I'd take a slightly different view on the rise in inequality. If you look at the entire world, there's been an enormous decrease in inequality because there have been hundreds of millions of people around the world brought up from abject poverty into the middle class. Within a country, however, there has been some rising inequality, but in some sense that's a natural thing. Think about those of you old enough to remember Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. They got married and divorced twice. That was a long time ago. Probably nobody really read about that because we weren't really a global company back in the 60s and early 70s. But when George Clooney and his fiancée got married, I'll bet that was in at least 20 or 30 different countries in their major newspapers and probably on the front page. Why? Because the reach of movie stars or athletes or whatever is now not a couple 100 million people in the United States, but it's billions of people around the world. So the leadership of global companies then naturally, when their reach is expanded, it's just natural that they get the benefit of that new reach, and it takes a while to filter down throughout the company. The second point I would make, and that's to Matthew's question about this anti-globalization. I think if we go back to kind of building on what Jim mentioned about the purpose of trade is to take advantage of the law of comparative advantage. So you produce the products in your country that you're the best at. When everybody does that, that increases efficiencies around the world and makes products much cheaper. But there's a limit to that, and Milton Friedman was a huge proponent of free trade. He said, China wants to give us refrigerators, we should just take them. It doesn't matter, we lose the people that build refrigerators, but they're free, let's just take them. But there's a limit to that, and there are two limits. One is that law of comparative advantage doesn't quite work when you've got one side of the trade that doesn't quite play fair. When that side subsidizes its industries or makes it impossible for our countries to enter their markets, then the trade isn't reciprocal and it's not balanced. So that's maybe kind of the cheating thing. The other part is the diversification risk. Maybe let's say that in a completely free trade, and we want to, maybe China is the best at building computer chips. So then we end up buying all of our computer chips from China. But it's those computer chips that get put into military fighter planes. And suddenly, if we're in a war with somebody, we need those chips, but they may not be forthcoming when we need them. So there's a diversification risk when you have total free trade, and it's those two things. It's not reciprocal free trade, and it's the fact that you want to be able to produce some things in your own country that may be necessary for your security, that I think people, the world in general, certainly in the United States, are recognizing these two limits of globalization.
Yes, to follow on a bit from what Paul just said, national security is a valid reason for putting tariffs on and for impairing free trade under WTO rules. That's very clear. With the steel tariffs, one of the things that the Trump administration has used to try to justify steel tariffs is the national security interest. There is a catch for that, though, because the steel that is useful for national security is what you build tanks and ships with. In other words, plate steel, not bar, and rod steel. US facilities are operating at capacity in those areas of steel already. So the national security argument wouldn't stand up if it's challenged at the World Trade Organization. That's a kind of esoteric point on trade, but I think it's the kind of thing you're going to see alleged by governments, as well as perhaps challenged in different ways. I mean, I've seen it suggested even that the steel tariffs wouldn't stand up in US courts because the national security interest isn't really valid. But, you know, one of the misperceptions that I find most concerning is the idea that you hear from the administration of this country and from some other countries that somehow a trade deficit means you're losing. As Bob said, if the Chinese are offering us free refrigerators, why not take them? In other words, if you get a trade deficit, it means you are having stuff sent to you that you're not fully paying for by your own efforts. Isn't that a good deal rather than a bad deal? Now, the question on trade deficits then becomes, are they sustainable? And remember that trade balance plus the capital account balance must add up to zero. So if your capital account is in surplus, then your trade account is almost inevitably in deficit and it's sustainable. Why is the US trade capital account in surplus? It's for two reasons. One is innovation in this economy makes it an attractive place for global investors to invest. And we know that, we do a lot of that. We bring billions of foreign money into US securities regularly. So there's an example of the capital account being in surplus. Another example, what do Americans own abroad? They own equity, very high return, global companies. What do foreigners own in the United States? An awful lot of treasury bonds, very low return. That differential of return creates a surplus in the capital account. So what I would advocate here is, in economic structure, it would be very hard for the US not to run a trade deficit, just because of the capital account surplus. And furthermore, it's rather good that we can, because it means there's a lot of pretty cheap stuff there for sale in retailers. And that actually is something that the US electorate benefits from.
In advance of this conversation, we were in the back, and we'll be talking about the unintended consequences of globalization. We were discussing what we were doing over the last week. We had a couple of folks who had just returned from China and prepared for this call about a week and a half ago. Jim was on his way to Heathrow Airport and able to take a call, going through tunnels and everything. Rachel was talking about after the inauguration, she hopped on a plane and went to London to go kind of have a few drinks at the pub immediately. And in chatting with my students here, I would say, in large part, we are not negatively affected by globalization in the way that some are. We benefit disproportionately from globalization. However, also in our classes, we talk about you are no longer competing as students with the people people in your class. You are competing with 3 billion new capitalists from Asia, Europe, etc., who are willing to do the jobs that you hope to get for 10, 20, 30%, on the dollar. Okay. My next question is, what are these unintended consequences of globalization that have provoked such a strong reaction? Who are the losers in this global economy? As these students move out and compete with global talent, they're going to find it increasingly difficult. And Rachel, is that what you would say provoked that flip from 10, 20 years ago, or what else? And yeah, I asked you first last time. Bob, do you want to take a first step? What are the unintended consequences of globalization, and how do we feel it? Even though we may benefit from it, how are people feeling it?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the vast majority of people in the United States benefited significantly. But I think there's a sizable group that really lost a job because of it, or maybe even the industry that was in their small town just completely disappeared. So the whole town lost their job. So they're really in a sad way, because now they can't even sell their house to move to North Dakota to get a job in the shale industry, driving a truck for 150 grand, because they can't even sell their house.
Does the vast majority know they've benefited from it, and do they vote accordingly?
No, I don't think so. But just in terms of low inflation and low cost of Walmart that bought, there's an old figure that if Walmart were a country, it would have been the 7th largest trading country in the world, because it was the stuff they were buying from China, and it made the cost of the middle class, reduced the cost of joining the middle class in the United States. But I think I'd have a slightly different view than Jim about the wages. I think there was a lot of pressure on wage growth in the United States from adding these hundreds of millions of low-wage, underemployed workers. If you look, for example, at the number of manufacturing workers in the U.S., that peaked starting in 1990. We lost a third of the manufacturing workforce, from 17.5 million down to 11.5 million. From 1990 to 2010. And then if you look at the workers' share of national income, the total wage and salary compensation as a share of U.S. national income, it peaked in 1991 and kind of stayed in a long-term range until about 95, which is when China joined the World Trade Organization. And then the workers' share of compensation has declined dramatically, 4 or 5 percentage points since then, to its low in 2010. So who were those people? Well, it was steel companies, it was auto workers, it was the steel workers in Pennsylvania, the auto workers in Michigan, the Rust Belt workers in Ohio and Indiana and Michigan. Those are the people that turned out and voted differently than they had in the last election. But it wasn't just manufacturing workers. I remember in the 90s, people were hiring PhDs from India, paying $10,000 or $20,000 for a PhD instead of $100,000 or $150,000 to that same PhD in New York. So there was significant pressure on wages, and I think that's part of where the disgruntlement is.
Rachel, would love your thoughts from the U.S. perspective.
I would agree entirely. I mean, there are communities all across Middle America today that have quite literally seen their manufacturing base disappear in a very short span of time. For those of us who spend time on the campaign trail, these folks were out and about and talking very vocally about their experiences. What they perceive on the ground, and public opinion polls are very clear about this, what they perceive on the ground is this idea that over time, the American political system has systematically moved in directions that have advantaged any number of populations around the world, but they have not advantaged American workers who are having a hard time finding a job. For a little while, we asked poll questions regularly saying, would you be willing to pay more for products made in the United States? And people routinely said yes.
Yes, would they really do?
And laughter is exactly the appropriate response to that. People love that idea, but consumer trends don't support it. The first thing people do, of course, is go to Walmart and find the cheapest option. And it is inevitably made overseas. And then, when their local community stores, those family-owned businesses that have been buying from American manufacturers and American clothing makers and any number of other American businesses for years and years and years, when those stores close because they no longer have business, that further takes that business center out of that small town community. And so, for example, I was at a Trump rally out in rural Iowa ahead of the caucuses, had a wonderful conversation with a farmer. And he grew up in this small town. He loves his small town. His kids have left. His grandkids have left. He wishes that they were around because the town that he remembers is really remarkable. And it no longer exists. And the only jobs that are available in his small town are at the Walmart that's about 20 miles away. And he doesn't know what to do. He's frustrated, he's angry, he feels left behind. And I think most importantly, he feels like the politicians in the United States are not listening to him. That they don't care, that they're more interested in elevating the standard of living for poor people around the world, or they're more interested in elevating the income for major multinational corporate owners, or they're more interested in making sure that Wall Street investors are doing well. They perceive that the system has left them behind. And so while all the big picture macro level economic trends are true, drug trade does not have to be zero-sum, globalization overall has greatly reduced inequality around the world, there are small communities all across the United States that have a very different perception of the world because their immediate experience is very different.
I think that, as Rachel has said, perceptions of the economics have driven the populism in politics. And I think what you saw at the Trump rally in rural Iowa would be very similar to what you'd hear at a National Front rally in rural France or an AfD rally in Germany. I think the perception, and with some justification, is that things have got worse for people outside of the big coastal cities, which is where economic activity has moved. I find that fascinating and actually a little bit puzzling. When you first saw technology really taking hold of the economy of the world in the 80s and 90s, the perception was with communications, you'll be able to do any job anywhere. It won't matter if you're in the cities. Well, the reverse has happened. And I think that's an important social trend, which will continue to be important for politics. The cities have become ever more the driver of the economy. And why is that? Just think about who the biggest companies in the United States are. They're Apple, Facebook, Google. You know, they're companies that don't have a lot of plant equipment. They're companies that have intellectual property. And that intellectual property consists of what people find out when they study and the ideas they get when they discuss things. Where does that happen? Mostly in the big cities. Now, you're obviously in Des Moines, Iowa. Things have really improved here. 16 years ago, when I was first based here, the place emptied out downtown at about 4:30 in the afternoon. Nowadays, it keeps going till midnight, and most of the people who are having frenzied discussions over a drink or two are actually in their 20s. This city has really changed, and that's very healthy. It shows that even smaller metropolitan areas can actually, if they've got the right combination of education and technology, can create a very positive environment. I think that's a great story we should all be quite proud of and also take advantage of. However, where does that leave the rural areas? And I think if you look at it that way, I think that ultimately, if you look at the last few years, the biggest mistake I would argue that these globalist governments made was not doing enough to help the disadvantaged people, particularly in the rural areas, like your friend whose children and grandchildren had left town. Those rural areas needed help. There are ways that they could become more productive, but the political will, certainly on either side of the Atlantic, and even in Japan, wasn't there. If I look at manufacturing, though, Bob is right, maybe a third of the jobs went in just over a decade. But US manufacturing production is still at record high. How can this be? That's technology. So I think both cheaper places to do stuff around the world and the technology have driven this trend. I think I could debate with Bob how important the two factors are, but they're definitely both there. And if it's any consolation, talking to Chinese policymakers, as I do from time to time, they complain that you can make shirts much cheaper in Bangladesh and Vietnam. They think, hey, we're losing our Chinese jobs to countries where production is cheaper. So this is a cycle that keeps going, but we will always find the ways that we can be more productive, particularly in the new and rather exciting economy.
Thank you. Jim, I remember the book, The Death of Distance. And on the front of the book, there was a business student, I'm sure, in a suit, in flip-flops, on the beach, with a computer, doing business from anywhere. And I think the converse is that cities have become even more and more. We've kind of concluded round one, which is facts. And now we're moving a little bit farther off onto the edge of the cliff, which is opinions and prognostications. And one of you submitted a fantastic question. If you do have questions, I would encourage you to write them down on a card, and we're going to get through as many of these as possible. The first question is about developing countries. So you referred to Friedman's example of free refrigerators. How does that help emerging or developing nations, such as Africa, whose textile industries need to compete with free donation clothing via charities or altruism? So, maybe even in this room, in this country, we have benefited disproportionately from the post-World War II era of kind of trade and regulation. But for the poorest nations, does globalism offer false promises? And I know this is a panel about the future of the U.S. We'll get there shortly, but 3 out of 3 of our questions were about developing economies. So there we go. Jim, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. I'll start on this one. I'm sure Bob will have some comments as well. But if I look at the idea that it's a false promise, as Bob mentioned earlier, the growing middle class in the emerging world has been one of the great phenomena of the last 20 years. You've seen hundreds of millions, possibly 1 billion or 2 people, hauled out of poverty and able to get their way into a middle-class lifestyle. They've gone to being quite prosperous in middle-income countries, most notably China, but also in India, in Africa. One always hears bad news from Africa, but actually in many African countries there is a growing middle class, and that's been facilitated by more trade and better use of technology. So in parts of Africa there is a very positive story. Now this has been facilitated by trade. Is there a downside for those people? Well, there obviously is, from my example of China, where textile production is moving to cheaper places. But, having got the start with textiles, the Chinese have moved into being part of global supply chains, producing much more sophisticated goods. And Bob gave the example of maybe Asian, probably Korean, microprocessors or memory chips being used in computers in this country. That's the difference in trade that has happened over the last 15 years. It's no longer true that you make stuff in one country and send it to another. You get a supply chain where components get traded, and you end up with a finished product that was made in a lot of different places. I think that's an important phenomenon, and one that actually, I think, protects people from the ongoing downward path if the countries they're in can continue developing and moving to the next stronger area of the economy. But change is inevitable, we can't really regret it. And I think that's one of the issues. People often don't like change.
And I'll turn it over to Bob, and then we'll move to US policy. I think it is interesting, and I'm a little scared to say this out loud, that we also enjoy the benefit of tremendous agricultural subsidies here in Iowa. And in some ways, we subsidize our cotton and corn production more than the combined GDPs of the lowest nations that want to access those markets. So that also was reflected in some of the comments. Bob, how would you characterize the ability of those countries to compete and the effects of globalization on developing nations?
Well, I totally agree with Jim. Shirts and the production of shirts and shoes has for decades or maybe centuries been the way that developing countries get their first step up on the development ladder. Because shirts and shoes take a dexterous hands, they take a lot of people, it's labor intensive, and that's how they get started. And China's moved away from that. If you look at the back label of your shirt, 40 years ago it used to say made in Japan, and then it said made in China, and now they say made in Bangladesh or something like that. The difficulty with the countries in Africa, though, is governance. As you look at the level of the quality of institutions in a country, there's a fascinating study by the World Bank that ranked countries on their level of the quality of institutions in different ways on the up and down axis, and then along the bottom axis, the amount of gross domestic product, which is total output per country. And it's very interesting that people on the poorest side always have the poorest governance, the poorest quality of institutions, meaning rule of law, how long it takes to start a business, is justice the same for everybody in the country, or are there punishments the same for an equal offense? Whereas on the other side of the graph, all the rich countries had very good governance. So the problem in Africa is dictatorships, it's lack of governance, it's the lack of rule of law. All of those things don't lead to investment, to entrepreneurship. If you want to get rich, you got to have innovation, you got to have entrepreneurs, you got to have people that look around and say, this is a new idea and I'm willing to invest my time and my capital in building it. And it's that kind of entrepreneurship and innovation that makes a country rich. And if you don't have a good government, if you don't have the ability to know that if I make money off this product, I can keep that money, that the government is not going to come expropriate it from me, then there's no reason for you to do it. There's no reason for you to waste your time or your effort or your money on doing something like that. That's the problem with Africa. There are a few countries that have good governance, and if that could ever happen, widespread, we could find another billion low-wage, underemployed people to make globalization continue. But I'm afraid that's very difficult.
So speaking about good governance and good government, Rachel, let's pivot to the U.S. And ask, I think we've seen over the last 2 weeks a conversation, a robust dialogue about trade and tariffs, and maybe even sparking and conversations about trade and wars. Our next question is basically very straightforward. Trump's tariffs, will his bluff get called? And so could you give us a very short synopsis of what's happened up until this point? And maybe offer an opinion, do you think his bluff will get called?
Well, I think his bluff is being called in various ways right now. And I think will continue to be. We have...
You want to use that?
I'm going to use this. Maybe you're just laughing. So, obviously, the president has, this whole thing started really with the announcement of tariffs on steel and aluminum. And that announcement came without seemingly any real dialogue or conversation within the administration. And then immediately, of course, there was pushback both from the European Union as well as from China. One of the things that's been really interesting about watching this back and forth between various countries talking about tariffs, before I get to the really interesting thing, among American voters, we have a lot of opinions about globalism and a lot of opinions about trade. We don't have a lot of knowledge about
Which is
tariffs.
why we're here.
Exactly, which is why we're here. So
We started
congratulations
with
for
facts.
being here. But there are a lot of misperceptions about what is going on in terms of Donald Trump's appeal to his base. Because there are questions about the degree to which, first of all, his base really understands the issues that are at play here. And second of all, the degree to which the president himself seems to understand the international dynamics and relationships that are at play here. So, on that point, one of the things that I have found very interesting is the fact that when the EU responded to the threat of tariffs initially, before there was any sort of exception, structure for exceptions that seemed to be under discussion, they were very interesting. A lot of people kind of joked about the fact that the EU came back and said, if you do this, we're going to put tariffs on bourbon and Levi's and Harley Davidsons.
Not bourbon.
Yeah. As a person whose family comes from Kentucky, that made me sad. But a lot of people are like, what a random bunch of stuff.
It's a Senate majority.
I was going to say, there's nothing random about that list of things, right? Bourbon comes from Kentucky, the home of the Senate Majority Leader. Harley Davidsons are made in Wisconsin, happens to be the home of the Speaker of the House. These are politically savvy responses. It is not a coincidence that the round of retaliatory tariffs include frozen pork, welcome to Iowa, right? Frozen pork, nuts and berries, orange juice was on the list, right? These are products that are targeting politically sensitive areas in the United States. And I would argue that foreign governments have a great deal more information about and understanding of the domestic politics in the United States and how to specifically target the president's base than the president's administration has regarding the domestic politics in China or the EU or any other country. And so that mismatch of knowledge becomes incredibly important when you start heading into an era of retaliatory tariffs. And I would go even one step probably further than that and say this is compounded by the fact that many of the positions that would have this expertise in the State Department have not been filled. And so there is a lack of expertise within the administration to help guide the president on what the domestic politics in these countries is and how these tariffs are going to impact these countries and what their likely response would be.
I think it's very interesting how President Trump is walking back from these threats remarkably quickly. I was very struck by the signing ceremony for the order on steel and aluminum tariffs. The president was in the Oval Office surrounded by steel workers. It was a nice photo shot with American middle-class people, which was exactly what he wanted. But then when he started talking, he said something to the effect that, well, you know, the Canadians and the Mexicans are going to renegotiate NAFTA with us, so they won't be tariffed. And the Germans are going to pay more for their own defense, they won't be tariffed. That was essentially what he was saying. I mean, that's three of the biggest exporters of steel to the United States. And it made it very clear that he saw it as transactional. And I think that that is the hope here, that others will see it as transactional too, and not end up in a trade war. I think the real danger here is that it turns into Smoot-Hawley 1930. Because what happened with Smoot-Hawley in 1930, with a very similar bunch of tariffs on basic imports, you had retaliatory tariffs from other countries, you you ended up with volume of world trade going down, what, 30 or 40% in a 3-year period. That's what created the Great Depression and, you know, the soup kitchens and the poverty that went with it, because it threw workers out of a job. I actually come from a whiskey town in Scotland, where before the Great Depression there were 23 distilleries in a town of 6,000 people. That's a lot. It does. And they were all producing whiskey at maximum level for the US market. Now, in the early 1930s that went. They've now got a lot of former distilleries that are used for other things, and only 2 whiskey distilleries in the town, which is still pretty good for a town of 6,000. But what I'm really pointing to here is industry, some of it in small towns, aimed at exports, was very vulnerable during that period of competing tariffs. I don't think it requires great insight to see that that's what would happen if there was a really intense trade war now. I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's maybe a 20 or 30% probability it does, and it happens through miscommunication and misuse of tariff threats in ways that don't lead to face-saving agreements that actually could, if some of the things that the steadier hands in the administration are talking about, it is possible that you could actually end up with them improving some of the frictions in world trade. I think it's too early to be that optimistic, but I do think that the risk of a trade war may in some ways be being overestimated. In evidence, I would point to the equity market, which, if they really got it into their heads there was a trade war coming, the market would be down sharply. That hasn't happened, and I think it's because of this transactional way that each player is seeing the threat of tariffs. And I think that Rachel really pointed out quite how transactional it is for some of the threats coming from China and the EU.
And to add on that, I think we have a fantastic question. You mentioned the equity markets. How will these tariffs and other protectionist policies affect the financial markets? And I think you addressed that. And then the next part of the question is, in the long run, so any thoughts about how these tariffs and protectionist policies maybe over the longer term affect the financial markets?
I'm going to wisely leave this to the economists in the room.
Well, I would look ahead, and I think we can look ahead with a very positive outlook, because some of the, I think what we're doing now is moving beyond globalization. If you think back, it's been my view that the sentiment against globalization has come about from, from stagnant wages over a long period of time. And if you look back just a little bit at some of the political changes, you know, political change happens in a country because people get mad, they don't like the Paine, or something is going on. There was a big political change. It started in 2006 when the Democrats took over Congress pretty thoroughly. Continued in 2008 when President Obama had very large Democrat majorities in both houses of Congress. Fast forward 8 years. Did the voters who wanted political change in 2006 and 2008 get what they wanted? No, because there was massive political change again in 2016, which says to me that what was really wanted was higher wages, because wages have been stagnant for a long time. So I think the outlook from now on is much better for those wages than it has been. Why is that? Well, you know, no cycle lasts forever, and every cycle contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Remember, we said globalization is about hundreds of millions of low-wage workers coming on the scene. The trick is, if you get a job in a steel manufacturer and your company, and you're in China, and your company exports steel, you're not going to stay a low-wage person for all that long. And wages in China, on average, have gone up at low double-digit rates now for almost 20 years. The average wage in China is now at or above the average of Mexico, whereas 20 years ago it was about 10 or 15% that of Mexico. So China today, because of higher wages, is not a low-cost producer anymore. And in fact, I've got a list of 35 or 40 Chinese companies that are or have been building manufacturing plants here in the United States. If you look at the Boston Consulting Group, the manufacturing cost in the United States is only just a fraction above the average manufacturing cost in China. So now we've had significant political change, and an awful lot of the things that have happened are going to have the outcome of raising wages. Fiscal stimulus at a very late stage in the in the business cycle, when the labor market is already somewhat tight, that's going to raise wages. A tax cut that makes an incentive for business to capital invest and bring money back from abroad to be invested here. That's good for wages because our labor market is tight. What does protectionism do? Well, it creates jobs. The idea is to kind of help create jobs in the U.S., which is good for wages. So I think we're on the verge of a significant wage surge. And I mentioned earlier, worker compensation as a percent of national income, it has bottomed over the last, if you look at it kind of from a cyclical standpoint, it has bottomed over the last 6 or 8 years. And I think it's just about to break out to the upside. So I have a very positive view that the benefits of globalization are here. But you know, globalization is just a cycle. It took, it took 20 years, 25 years to integrate 1.5 billion new low-wage workers into the global economy. But a lot of that is done. A lot of that is in the past. So I got a positive view about what's going to happen in the U.S. as we look down the road.
Maybe I can just add, Bob, that you've seen that in analysing principles own data. We have an enormous amount of data on people that work and are in the pension plans that we administer, and Bob's team have looked at that and have seen the beginnings of pay rises in smaller and growing businesses. That's really the place where it started. But I think that's evidence that this is going to get more entrenched in the economy.
As a quick follow-up to that, because we have a number of questions that we're going to be addressing here shortly. First, we have a question: is there a risk of populist policies actually erasing prosperity gains? Jim?
Yeah, I was looking at Rachel because that's actually a political question. If they do, then the self-correcting mechanism will happen. The politics will change. And that was the good news. It took a long time in the 1930s, but the New Deal was expansionary through fiscal expansion. And then, of course, I don't on economic grounds, I don't suggest this, although it worked on economic grounds. Production did go up necessarily because of the war effort, and that got American industry moving, and it never really looked back. But more realistically, a fiscal and monetary stimulus plus some revision, some walking back of the restrictionist policies would happen if there was a real hit to prosperity.
You're going to leave it there? Perfect. The next question is about midterm elections.
Oh, great.
So we have just we're going to ask about bold predictions a little bit later. So your biggest and your boldest predictions we'll save for last.
Okay.
But this one is about midterm elections. We have a couple questions here. What do you see, the role of this trade debate plays in midterm elections? And a similar question: do you see the trend of U.S. voter in anti-globalization continuing in the 2018 midterm elections?
So one of the interesting things that we've seen, I mentioned before that we saw this 180 in public opinion polls regarding attitudes towards globalization and specifically trade deals. And since the election, polls have been really muddy. And this is one of the, goes along with the fact that we actually lack a lot of detailed and nuanced information about what these economic markets are actually doing, what our trade deals are doing. So for example, the public seems right now to be pretty split on whether or not major trade deals should be renegotiated. they seem to be pretty split on whether or not globalization on the whole is a good or bad thing. There are deep divisions right now in terms of the quote-unquote populist sentiment that we saw in 2016, which I think actually did largely arise from this anti-globalism sentiment that was on the campaign trail, that was a focus for the campaigns of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And so going into the 2018 elections, I think there's a lot of ambivalence about where we stand right now in terms of trade deals, in terms of global relationships. There has been a movement of Trump voters away from Donald Trump on this issue. And remember that, of course, Donald Trump is not on the agenda in 2008. There's not on the ballot in 2018. So we're looking at smaller geographic units. We're looking at fundamentally different races with different candidates. I do expect, just sheerly given the number of retirements that we've seen, I expect that we will see a big influx of Democrats into the House of Representatives. That is not, that will be heralded by Democrats as a clear repudiation of the president. It is not necessarily a clear repudiation of the president. Historically, that's simply what happens. That is true for virtually any president, that in midterm elections, the president's party will lose seats in Congress. And so, I think the midterm elections will not, I don't think, provide a very clear statement on the issue of globalization or economic policy regarding trade or tariffs. I think very few congressional candidates are looking forward to talking about this a whole lot on the campaign trail. So I don't think it's actually going to be a significant point of conversation, even going into the midterms. It'll continue to happen largely at the administrative level with the president. There's very little that any of these candidates could potentially do to change trade if they were elected.
Move on to the next question.
Outstanding. So I heard one prognostication that there would be an influx of Democratic.
I was going to say to Rachel, so the Democrats probably take the House. What about the Senate?
Wow, now we're getting close to the cliff.
Jump off.
I won't jump off it. I'm less convinced that the Democrats will take the Senate. I think there's a potential that they could gain a couple seats. I don't know where we're going to end up on this. The House has been much more tumultuous over the past several months, and so I feel much more comfortable with the House on this matter. The Senate, however, actually does have the potential to be involved in some of these debates in a way that the House does not. And still, I don't think we're going to hear a lot about it. But I don't want to go out on that limb yet. I'm not going over your cliff.
Outstanding. So again, if you do have questions, write those down on a card and hold them up. We've got a few. Denise has got the cards behind us. A couple of the questions again are around the political obligations, and I remember the line in the State of the Union. I am not the president of the world. My obligation is to protect the interests of the U.S. people first. And so I guess one of my big questions is, what is the fundamental role of the U.S. in the world? Is a prosperous world good for the U.S.? Do we have some other sort of moral obligation to lead the world in this way? So that would be an interesting question.
I think that it's a bit of a tautology, actually, for the president to say, I'm not the president of the world, I'm the president of the United States. That's just factually true. However, when you really think about what's good for the United States, a lot of what we do here is used by other countries and used in global communication, manufacturing, whatever. I mean, what is it that the US really has an edge in? Aerospace, technology, the technology products, including what is really important, the software, the applications to make it run. Entertainment content, even legal services. These are big export industries. They're not the car industry, which used to be a big export industry. There's probably more, I mean, it's not that it's moved abroad, it's moved from the upper it's moved from the Midwest and Pennsylvania to the South, where there's obviously different politics and different employment conditions. So if you take all that, where is the US's interest really? And I think that the US has done well out of trade, out of economic growth worldwide, during the period of the World Trade Organization, which was after all designed by the United States in the late 1940s. So the post-war economic arrangements were seen by many countries as a stitch-up in favor of the United States. Now obviously it didn't work out entirely that way. For the reasons that we've been discussing, some people here were disadvantaged. I would say that's more a matter of social policy than of economic policy, really. And I think I'd go back to my point that governments in many countries have not done enough to help the people who were displaced by the various processes that were going on.
Absolutely. Bob, we've withdrawn from UNESCO, we've withdrawn from the TPP, and one of our former Drake alumnus, or former Drake students, was the chief negotiator, agricultural negotiator for the TPP. And we've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. We've withdrawn, at least rhetorically, at least challenged NAFTA and others. What is the role of the U.S. in the world?
Well, since World War II, the U.S. has, in some sense, been the world's policeman. And you know what happens in a small town or any town when the police force stops or decides they're going to go on strike? Well, it might not be a very pleasant place. And in some sense, in the last several years, as we have, I think the withdrawal from the world's policeman role has not just been in the last year, it's been really more perhaps over the last decade or so. And I think we've seen a lot of regional conflicts rise because of that. I'm not saying we should be, but that's been the role that we have fulfilled, and in some sense, the world has been a more peaceful place because of that. Another role that we have fulfilled is, just as Jim mentioned, kind of a governance role. We have fulfilled a role that's about how should we trade? What are the rules of trade? What are the rules of conduct with international commerce around the world? We've also fulfilled that role of kind of being the leader of that. And in some sense, somebody needs to do that. Now, I'd make a third point here, which is kind of a real failure of globalization. If you recall, one of the hopes was some time ago that increasing trade, I mean, this was true early on of Russia, trade with Russia, and certainly true of trade with China. The more countries get intertwined because of international commerce, then the less the opportunity is, or the less the odds are that there's going to be a military conflict. And the hope was in China that with a lot more trade, the Chinese party would see the benefits of this and turn away from what has been really an empire into much more of a democratic opening up their political system. That has been a total, absolute failure. That has not happened. And with the current president, who's now president for life, we've seen really a re-emergence.
This is in China, not the United States.
Yes, in China. In China, yes. We've seen a re-emergence of Mao's Little Red Book and of people telling of their sins in some sense in front of comrades. So that has been a real failure.
So this is the point in the conversation. It's 7:15, and I know some of the students in the back, it's probably past your bedtime. So what we're going to do now is go way out on the limb. And what I would ask very kindly is to make bold projections, bold prognostications, and then for our students and audience members, if you could relate that bold prognostication to students, 20, 21, 22 years old, who are heading out into the world, I would be very interested in how you think, whatever you want to say about the future of trade and U.S. policy in the era of anti-globalism, how does it affect the folks here in our audience, our great students?
I would suggest that trade over the next few years will be impaired but not destroyed. What I mean by that is you will see threats followed through in some limited respects as ways of negotiation, but I do not see the end of globalization happening. I think you're going to see, through the political processes that we've described, much more willingness to do something about the disadvantaged. And what that means, actually, as much as anything, is more training and more ability to do different things rather than necessarily welfare handouts. I think helping people be more equipped for the changed economy is going to be very important politically. Now, in terms of markets, which I spend a lot of my time thinking about, against that background, I think you should continue to be invested in the United States. And I say that primarily because we have such an innovative and strong private sector, a lot of technology, a lot of change. I think that will continue to make the United States a good place to invest. Indeed, you may have mixed opinions about this, but the new tax code reduces the tax on business and probably accelerates the dominance of the US capital account as one that sucks in investment capital, and by the way, probably makes the trade deficit stay stubbornly negative. So I think that the US will continue to do quite well. Here's a kind of counter-consensus point of view. Growth will continue to be okay in Europe and Japan, but I do think that the makeup of those markets is such that the US will do better. If you look at the big companies in the US market, as I mentioned, Facebook, Alphabet, the parent of Google, you have Apple, obviously, you have Microsoft. You get to tech companies, you get to about number 5 or 6 before you find one that's not a tech company. If you look at Europe, the big companies are banks, manufacturers, oil companies. Find companies but not the new economy. To me, that suggests that the market prospects are less good, even though the economic prospects may be okay. Lastly, on interest rates, I would agree with Bob that wages are going to do better looking forward, but I think they do better in an environment that will continue to see the deflationary impact of technology. I do not expect prices to take off, even if wages go up somewhat. And so my thought is, I find it hard to think that the 10-year bond yield in a year's time should be very far from where it is right now, which is 280. That would be a counter-consensus comment as well. So maybe I'm a bit out on a limb there, but it'll be interesting in a year's time to see if I'm right.
So Jim, what I heard you say to all our budding investors, invest in the US and their wages are going up.
Should be.
Outstanding. You heard it here first. That's good news.
So I remain an optimist in the United States.
Outstanding. Next. Bold prognostications and relating it to our students. Absolutely.
All right.
To our students.
I'm going to get in the weeds just a little bit from a political science perspective here, because that's what I do and it's fun. Jim mentioned earlier that there was a self-corrective mechanism in the New Deal, and one of the things from a historical standpoint in studying American politics, throughout American politics, every 30 to 40 years, we have witnessed a fundamental restructuring of our party coalitions and the policy commitments that the dominant coalition makes, a shift in the relationship between the citizen and the state, different conceptions of the kinds of long-term policy goals that that the dominant mainstream of American politics is seeking. And so just periodically, every 30 to 40 years, we see this happen. And there are several scholars who have mapped kind of presidential cycles onto this theory of realignment. And what they've said is, over the 30 to 40 years, you can see a series of presidents who come into the office, and by definition, every coalition that comes together will gradually fragment over time. And so over the course of this 30 to 40 years, you're going to have a dominant set of policy commitments, and you're going to have a dominant political party, and over time that political party is going to be harder and harder and harder to hold together. And by the end of the cycle, you're going to see a dominant party coalition that fragments beyond repair. And then it's time for a new party coalition to come together, and the parties will realign around a new set of issues and a new set of policy commitments. All of the hallmarks for the end of the 30 to 40 year cycle are happening right now in terms of our politics. We call it a period of disjunctive politics. We see a Republican president who was not favored by a majority in the Republican Party for most of the 2016 election. In fact, was actively opposed by most people in the Republican Party for most of the 2016 election. You see a party coalition in both the House and the Senate that is deeply fragmented. You have divisions between the mainstream, the Tea Party, the social conservatives, the foreign policy hawks. You have a whole bunch of different factions within the Republican Party, and you have a president that's struggling mightily to hold this thing together and doesn't seem to be getting a lot of traction within his own party, much less with the other parties. The coalition that we're in right now really came together in 1980 around President Ronald Reagan with the realignment of the South as the South became Republican. And so it's been a dominant Republican coalition since 1980. And that is 37 years ago, which means we're right about on time for a pretty fundamental shift in our politics. I think in 10 years or so, you're going to look back on this period of time and we're going to say that was a critical period of American politics, and trade and anti-globalism was one of those issues that divided the traditional party structure and led to a fundamental restructuring of American politics. So, if you right now are in college, this could be a bumpy ride. Everybody hold on to your hats. It will end up okay. We always believe that we're living through extraordinary times. The good news is we've done this before, so it's going to be okay. But the second thing I think is to get involved in politics, to maintain kind of a careful watch on what's going on in our political parties and where you want to position yourself. Because I think the parties that we have right now likely are going to look very, very different in 5 years. Maybe it'll take a little longer, but 5 to 10 years.
So translation, fundamental shift in politics means winter is coming, the end is nigh.
The end is not nigh. We've done it before, we'll do it again.
Hold on to your hat.
Right? This is an evolutionary process. The parties we have today are not the parties we had 50 years ago. They're not the parties we had 100 years ago. Our political system shifts and it self-corrects as necessary. The New Deal was a realignment. It was not just a correction in terms of economics, it was a political realignment. And I think we could end up in a similar circumstance.
And to Bob's earlier comment, we do have strong institutions here, and we're fortunate to have good governance here to withstand such fundamental shifts. I'll turn it over to Bob. Hold for our Constitution.
Yes, I'll make about 4. Number one, I see us at the beginning of a long, kind of a Cold War in terms of trade and political and military rivalry with China. And I don't necessarily see that getting any better. I don't think it'll get hot, but it will stay on a mild to pretty warm simmer. Number 2, I totally agree with most everything Jim said. I think interest rates might be just a little higher at the end of the year, but I won't argue. And I think the U.S. is a good place to be invested. However, I think you might want to think about that for the short term, because you might find within 18 to 24 months a better opportunity to get invested in the stock market. Third, I do think wage growth is the next bull market. And if there were a financial security in that, that is what I would buy. And last, for you students who are maybe getting out of college, it kind of feels to me like the job opportunities that are going to be available to you are much greater than they have been for any graduating class in maybe 15 years, maybe even more. And it could be as much, the opportunities could be as good as they were back in the late 60s and early 70s, where the early baby boomers who got out of college could just kind of walk into about any job they wanted. May not be quite that good, but I think it's going to be really good for you.
With that, I think we've heard, continue to invest in the U.S. You're in for a bumpy ride. Get involved, because you have the opportunity to create your own destiny and job opportunities. The only other thing that I will say as an educator, as a teacher, is my sense is that training and education is only going to become more important. Principal has been a leader in our community around emphasizing the need to have a global mindset, one that proactively and regularly seeks inspiration and opportunity across national boundaries, but also across cultural boundaries, across functional boundaries. So that means the arts and sciences, speaking with the College of Business. That means accountants talking to marketers. And we sincerely appreciate Principal for sponsoring this dialogue and our students. With that, I want to say thank you individually, Bob, Rachel, and Jim, for giving your time this evening. This was absolutely fantastic, and I hope we will all point back at this evening as the first night that we recognize there's a fundamental disruption coming, and yet it's all going to be okay. And the night that we had to bring in 2 extra rounds of chairs. So please give our